Kalen's workspace became more than a repair bay. It evolved into a kind of clinic for broken things, not just bodies but machinery, systems, even the air itself. Station decontamination units relied on harsh chemicals and radiation to scrub surfaces clean. They left behind molecular residue, traces of toxins that built up over time in ship hulls and ventilation systems. Kalen's methods were different. They would place their hands on a contaminated surface and go still. Their eyes would lose focus. To a human observer, it looked like meditation. Or magic. They tried to explain it to Gareth one evening as they worked on a faulty air filtration unit. It wasn't supernatural. It was a question of energy. All matter vibrates. Toxins, radiation, decay, they each have a specific disruptive frequency. Standard cleaning just masks it. Kalen's ability allowed them to identify that frequency and introduce a counter-frequency. It was like tuning an instrument that had fallen out of key. They didn't destroy the toxin. They convinced it to neutralize itself, molecule by molecule. The process was silent, invisible, and left no trace. It was healing on an atomic scale. Gareth started showing up at the workshop not out of necessity but routine. He'd bring his evening rations and they'd eat in comfortable silence. Then his son Riley began to appear. The teenager finished his station classes and started drifting down to the lower decks, drawn by curiosity. He'd stand in the doorway watching Kalen's exact movements, the way they handled tools and components with a reverence most people reserved for living things. Riley was 15, an age when most kids on a frontier station were learning to strip a plasma rifle or pilot a cargo skiff. He found those things tedious. Kalen's work fascinated him. He started with small tasks. Fetching tools, holding a light. Kalen gave instructions in that soft, measured voice, never condescending, never impatient. Riley learned to listen to the quality of silence in the room, to recognize the shift in energy when Kalen was working at a deep level. He saw them decontaminate a water reclamation pipe that had been declared a total loss by station engineers. He watched them calm a sputtering power relay by simply resting a hand on its casing. It defied every technical manual he'd ever read. The boy began to understand that this was not a technical skill. It was a practice. It required a state of mind. One afternoon, he asked Kalen how they learned to do it. The hybrid didn't answer directly. Instead, they spoke of a ceremony from their lost culture called the reclaiming. It was not a celebration. It was an act of focus. Participants would gather and, through shared concentration, acknowledge a specific loss, a person, a place, a hope. They wouldn't try to forget the pain. They would hold it, examine it, and then, through a disciplined act of collective will, they would channel that emotional energy into a protective barrier for the living. Grief was not buried. It was transformed. It became a shield. That was the core of their healing. Not denying damage, but repurposing its energy. Riley fell quiet, turning the concept over in his mind. It was the first time anyone had offered him a tool that wasn't made of metal or code. The Horizon's dream drifted into Dustfall's outer docking ring with the sluggish gait of a dying animal. Its hull showed no battle scars, no impact marks. The damage was subtler. Thick, grayish streaks marred the thermal plating around its environmental vents. The ship's transponder kept broadcasting a standard identification code, but its internal systems were failing in cascading nonsensical patterns. The air filtration would spike to maximum, then shut down completely. Water recyclers dumped purified stores into waste tanks. Life support fluctuated between oxygen-rich and near-vacuum levels at random intervals. It made no engineering sense. The crew was worse. They stumbled down the ramp under strict quarantine protocol, their movements jerky, uncoordinated. Their skin had taken on a faint ashen tone. Some coughed up fine gray dust. Their eyes didn't focus properly. They stared through people, not at them. Station medics shoved them into isolation units, their faces tight beneath their clear protective visors. No one said the words void plague aloud. They didn't need to. The memory of Drora 7 was a fresh wound on the frontier. Fear travels faster than any virus. Kalen observed from a distance at first. They watched the decontamination team spray the ship's hull with standard biocides. The chemical mist beaded on the gray streaks without penetrating. They saw the readings from the medical scans, cellular degradation that mirrored archival records from lost colonies. This wasn't natural decay. The patterns were too systematic, the damage too precise. They approached the station's emergency council, their voice calm amidst the rising panic. They requested permission to examine the Horizon's dream. not as a medic, as a forensic specialist. The council members, a mix of station administrators and senior merchants, listened with skeptical faces. They sat around a scratched composite table in the command center, displays flashing with alarming updates. They saw a dragon hybrid, an outsider asking for access to their biggest crisis. The same Ravager from the corridor weeks before was there, representing the security concerns of the station's less lawful residents. He leaned forward, a cold smile on his face. "Convenient, isn't it?" he said, his voice cutting through the tense air. "A plague ship shows up, and the only one who knows how this void sickness works just happens to be here, offering to help." The accusation hung in the recycled air. No one defended Kalen. The council's fear was a tangible thing. They needed an explanation they could understand. They needed a culprit they could contain. A mysterious, unstoppable plague was too big, too abstract. A single outsider with strange abilities was a much simpler problem. Logic didn't matter. Evidence didn't matter. The human need for a target overrode everything else. They denied Kalen's request. They placed a guard outside the hybrid's workshop. Not for protection, for observation. Fear had chosen its scapegoat. The workshop felt different now. The quiet hum of tools and the clean scent of solvents were the same, but a new tension lingered in the air since the council's decision. Riley still came after his classes. He found a strange comfort in the order of the place, in the predictable rhythm of Kalen's work. They had started teaching him the basics of energy-based decontamination. It wasn't about scrubbing surfaces. It was about listening to them. Riley learned to feel for the dissonant vibrations of contamination, the subtle hum of imbalance that standard scanners often missed. He was practicing on a small section of scrap plating when he first saw the data. Kalen had pulled the sensor logs from the Horizon's Dream before the council locked them down. The files were a chaotic mess of system failures and corrupted readings. Station engineers had dismissed them as junk data, the useless noise of a dying ship. Riley was compiling a timeline of the environmental system crashes for Kalen, his brow furrowed in concentration. The patterns weren't random. He zoomed in on the molecular decay signatures from the crew's medical scans. The corrosion on the hull. The way the life support fluctuated. They weren't malfunctions. They were a sequence. Each event followed a specific, repeating progression. It started with a subtle energy surge in a non-critical system, which would trigger a cascade of precisely timed failures. The data didn't look like an accident. It looked like a recipe. He cross-referenced the mineral residue found on the hull with public galactic survey records. He wasn't looking for plague vectors. He was looking for mining reports. The grayish residue matched particulate matter from high-yield strip mining operations in the Crimson Nebula sector. He dug deeper, his datapad glowing in the dim light of the workshop. He pulled records from other so-called plague sites, Draoris 7, Cygnus Minor, the Kelper Belt outposts. Every single one showed the same mineral signature in environmental samples taken just before their collapse. The evidence was buried in petabytes of planetary survey data, overlooked because no one was looking for a connection between mining and plague. Experts saw a biological disaster. Riley saw a cover-up. The boy worked through the night, his fingers flying across the screen, connecting data points across star systems. He compiled everything into a single file, an evidence chain that was undeniable in its clarity. He found them at dawn. His father was doing maintenance checks on his sidearm at the small table. Kalen was realigning the energy crystals they used for deep healing. They both looked up as he entered, his face pale from lack of sleep, his eyes bright with a fierce, urgent light. He didn't say hello. He just placed his datapad on the table between them. The screen showed a star chart, now dotted with overlapping circles of mineral signatures and system failures. "It's not a plague," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He looked at Kalen. "They're mining these worlds. The sickness is just the waste." The investigation accelerated. The forensic teams on the Horizon's Dream confirmed everything. The damage was not from any known contagion. It was the residual effect of a focused molecular destabilization field, a weapon designed to break down complex matter into harvestable base elements. The data trail led them inward toward the core systems. The operation was vast. It spanned 17 corporate entities, all fronts for a single shadowy conglomerate. They had been executing this scheme for decades. carefully selecting remote, resource-rich worlds using the Void Plague as their perfect cover. They created the tragedy, then profited from the cleanup. It was genocide disguised as grief. On Dustfall, the mood shifted. The station's emergency council issued a formal public apology to Kalen. They granted them honorary citizenship and full access rights. The guards posted outside the workshop were removed. The settlement, shaken by its own complicity in the near persecution of an innocent being, began to reorganize itself. Kalen's healing center, once a hidden refuge, became a focal point. People started bringing them damaged systems, contaminated goods, even minor injuries, seeking the kind of cleansing technology couldn't provide. Trust, once broken, was being slowly mended. The three outcasts had succeeded where vast intelligence networks had failed, because they approached the problem from three different, complementary angles. Gareth brought the soldiers' understanding of patterns of attack and concealment. He knew how to hide an operation in plain sight because he'd done it himself in wartime. Kalen brought the healer's microscopic perspective. They could see the unnatural signature of the weapon, because they understood the natural state of healthy systems on a molecular level. And Riley brought the fresh, unbiased eyes of youth. He wasn't looking for a known pathogen or a familiar engineering failure. He was just looking for a pattern in the noise. He found it because he didn't know it was supposed to be impossible to find. Their combined perspectives created a lens powerful enough to see through the galaxy's most Jingshin orchestrated lie. They weren't experts in one field. They were outsiders in three, and that was their strength. Riley stood before a small power relay unit. His hands held a few inches from its humming casing. He closed his eyes, trying to mimic the deep stillness he'd seen in Kalen. He sought the discordant frequency, the subtle vibration that signaled an imbalance within the machine. A sharp, painful jolt snapped up his arms, and he jerked back with a gasp, shaking out his stinging fingers. On the other side of the workshop, Kalen didn't flinch. They observed the boy's frustration, the way he flexed his hands. Human nerve endings were not designed for direct energy manipulation. Their own biology allowed for a natural dampening effect, a built-in regulator that prevented feedback. Riley's system had no such protection. Kalen approached the workbench. They didn't tell him to try again. Instead, they picked up a small, smooth river stone from a collection on a shelf. "Your focus is a spear," they said, their voice low. "It seeks a single point. Try making it a net." They placed the stone in Riley's palm. "Feel its quiet. Not its surface, its center." It was an exercise from their own youth, adapted. They weren't teaching him to be a dragon hybrid. They were teaching him to use a human mind to achieve a similar end. The breakthrough happened weeks later. A station mechanic was brought in, his forearm badly burned by a plasma flare. Standard med gel had stabilized the wound, but the tissue was seared, the nerves screaming. Kalen moved to begin the work, but Riley stepped forward. He didn't try to copy their method. He laid his hands not on the wound, but on the healthy skin just above it. He remembered the stone. He didn't try to force the damaged cells to change. Instead, he focused on the undamaged ones, amplifying their natural, healthy resonance. He imagined that stable frequency spreading into the wound like a calm tide, encouraging the burned tissue to remember what wholeness felt like. The mechanic's sharp, pained breathing evened out. The angry red of the burn began to soften to a healthier pink. Gareth watched from the doorway, his own hands still. He saw the intense concentration on his son's face, a look he'd never seen during weapon drills or pilot simulations. This was not the path he had imagined for the boy. It was better. Riley was building something instead of learning to break it. The workshop, once a place of voodoo repair, was transforming. Others began to come, not just for Kalen's healing, but to learn the beginnings of this new blended technique. It was a school for a discipline that had not existed months before. Riley's ability was not an imitation. It was an adaptation. He couldn't directly manipulate energy flows like Kalen. His human biology rebelled against it. But he could listen. He could identify stability and amplify it. He could use his mind, trained by his mother's scientific rigor and his father's tactical awareness, to find a different path to the same result. His success came from his openness. He didn't try to become something he wasn't. He learned how to use what he was in a new way. He built a bridge between species, not by crossing it himself, but by designing a new kind of architecture. The official communique from the coalition arrived on a thin, flexible data slate bearing the seal of the Restoration Division. It authorized a 5-year mission focused on the ecological and medical rehabilitation of plague-damaged worlds. The primary condition was Kalen's leadership. Their unique understanding of the weapon's effects made them the only viable candidate to head the medical and decontamination efforts. The offer was comprehensive. It included relocation to Haven Prime, a core world with state-of-the-art research facilities, a dedicated fleet of restoration vessels, and a security detail for the entire operation. The resources were beyond anything Dustfall could ever offer. The 3 of them sat in the workshop that evening, the data slate resting on the workbench between them. The air, usually scented with solvent and ozone, felt different, heavier. This was the kind of opportunity people spent lifetimes hoping for. It was also an end. Dustfall was more than a sanctuary now. It was home. The workshop's walls were lined with the evidence of their shared struggle and hard-won peace. Leaving felt like a betrayal of that effort. It meant walking away from the first place where any of them had felt safe in years. Haven Prime represented a different kind of future. For Riley, it meant a spot at the Coalition Academy, access to real labs and libraries, a structured path for the brilliant, unconventional mind that had uncovered a galactic conspiracy. For Kalen, it was a chance to build a medical network that blended their ancestral techniques with human technology, to heal on a scale they had never dared imagine. For Gareth, it was a command position overseeing security for the entire restoration fleet, a return to purpose within a system he could finally believe in. Each offer was tailored perfect, and that was the problem. They were individual paths that could easily pull them apart. They didn't discuss it as 3 separate people weighing 3 separate offers. They discussed it as a unit. Riley spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. He said the academy meant nothing if it meant leaving them. Kalen pointed out that their techniques were useless if confined to a single workshop on a backwater station. Their value was in teaching others, in creating a system that could outlive them. Gareth listened, his gaze moving between his son and the being who had become his partner in all but name. He saw not 3 separate opportunities, but one single intertwined mission. The decision was made without a vote. It was a silent consensus that settled over the room. They would go, together. They would accept the challenge not as individuals, but as the foundation of something new, the bond they shared, forged in a dusty corridor under the threat of violence tempered by loss and discovery, was stronger than any comfort a familiar place could provide. They were not a family bound by blood or law. They were a family built by choice, reforged every day by the decision to stay, to protect, to trust. A blood relation is an accident of birth. A chosen family is a daily commitment. It is the conscious, repeated decision to face the unknown not alone but side by side, because the person next to you has already proven they will stand there when it matters most. Their strength came from that choice, made again and again in quiet moments and in crisis. It was a bond no inheritance could provide and no distance could break. They would face Haven Prime as they had faced everything else, together. Verdania stretched beneath their ship's viewport, a world scoured down to its bones. The vast forests were gone, leaving behind a cracked gray desert under a sickly orange sky. What the void plague hadn't dissolved, the scavengers had mined. They'd taken everything of value and left the skeleton. The ground was poisoned, the air thin and toxic. Standard restoration protocols were useless. Teams tried seeding genetically modified grasses, deploying atmospheric processors and injecting nutrient packs into the dead soil. Nothing took. The planet itself seemed to reject the help. The processes designed for damaged worlds couldn't handle a world that was fundamentally unmade. Kalen walked the perimeter of the main landing zone, their boots crunching on brittle ground. They stopped and knelt, placing a bare hand directly on the cracked earth. They didn't feel for life. They felt for potential, the memory of what was, the possibility of what could be. Back in the command tent, they laid out a new plan on a data slate. It wasn't a restoration proposal. It was a redesign. "We are not trying to put it back," they explained, their voice calm against the howl of the dry wind outside. "That is a ghost. We must build something new from the pieces that are left." A new ship arrived a week later. It carried Mentor Yarai, an elder dragon hybrid whose scales were the color of tarnished silver. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to calm the very air around her. Her purpose was not to lead, but to teach. She observed Kalen's work with the ruined soil, Riley's attempts to stabilize the toxic water table, Gareth's security patrols along the shifting perimeters. She saw not 3 individuals, but a single integrated system. She began showing Kaylin advanced techniques for large-scale energy realignment, methods that worked with the planet's deep geology rather than against it. Her teaching was quiet, a series of suggestions and observations that opened new pathways. The work was slow, frustrating. Then one evening, as the system's dim star began to set, Yarai suggested they hold a reclaiming. It was not a ceremony from any one culture. It was something new, built for this place, this moment. The entire settlement was invited. Scientists, security personnel, engineers. They gathered in a wide circle on the hard-packed ground. No one knew what to do. Kaylin began. It started as a low hum, a single steady note that vibrated in the chest. Riley joined in, finding a harmony that felt human, a melody of memory and hope. Others added their voices, a hesitant chorus against the vast, empty landscape. They sang without words. The sound was a collective breath, a shared intention. As they sang, a team on the perimeter reported a shift. The newly planted, genetically resilient saplings, which had struggled for weeks, suddenly straightened. Their leaves, previously pale and brittle, deepened to a vivid green. A sensor drone over the northern sea showed the thick, gray haze on the water's surface beginning to break apart, clearing patches of water so blue it seemed impossible. The change wasn't gradual. It was a sudden, undeniable leap forward. The models hadn't predicted it. The science couldn't explain it. The key wasn't in trying to force Verdania back into its old shape. That shape was gone. The world's core, its fundamental energy, had been shattered. The only way to rebuild was to accept the brokenness and use it as a foundation for something entirely different. Something forged in the collective will of those who refuse to accept its death. You don't restore a ghost. You build a new body for a new spirit. The song continued into the night, a net of sound thrown over a broken world. And for the first time in decades, the world began to sing back. Gareth found the metalsmith's workshop in a low-ceilinged annex off Dustfall's main market. The air smelled of hot metal and ozone. The artisan, an older woman with burn scars tracing her hands, listened without speaking as Gareth explained what he needed. He didn't ask for matching pieces. He described 3 different people. The challenge wasn't in the crafting. It was in finding materials that could hold the weight of their specific histories without collapsing into simple sentiment. He brought her a fragment of his old Coalition-issue armor plate. It was a dense matte gray alloy known as earth steel, prized for its ability to absorb and disperse kinetic energy. It was unbreakable in a fight, but useless for anything requiring subtlety. It was the material of shields, of fixed positions, of standing your ground. It represented his entire life, a history of protection that often felt more like a barrier. For Kaylin, he had nothing to give the smith. They had to source the material together. They located a small, reputable dealer in xenological artifacts who sold them a sliver of genuine Drauris crystal. It was a pale, milky stone that seemed to hold light within it, faintly shimmering even in the dimness of the shop. It was all that remained of a world. It was not a weapon. It was a memory. It was both incredibly fragile and impossibly resilient. Having survived the absolute destruction of its origin, it symbolized loss but also the stubborn act of continuing to exist. For Riley, the metalsmith proposed a fusion. She took slivers of the earth steel and fragments of the Drauris crystal and subjected them to a precise thermal process that didn't meld them, but instead grew one into the other. The resulting composite was striated, the dark gray of the steel weaving through the crystalline structure like roots through soil. It was a new material. It wasn't a blend. It was an integration. The steel gave the crystal durability. The crystal gave the steel a capacity to hold energy. It was a bridge. He brought the finished pendants back to the workshop. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply laid the 3 small objects on the clean surface of Kaylin's workbench. Each hung from a simple, unadorned chain. They gathered around. They only sound the hum of the environmental controls. Gareth picked up the earth steel pendant and placed it around Kaylin's neck. Kaylin took the Drauris crystal and fastened it around Gareth's. Then they both turned to Riley and together clasped the fused pendant around his. No one spoke. The act itself was the language. The pendants became a silent code. A touch to the cool metal of the earth steel was a question. Are you secure? A finger brushing the faint warmth of the Droris crystal was an answer. I remember. I endure. The composite piece Riley wore was a statement. We are connected. They were reminders worn against the skin, a physical anchor to their shared purpose. In meetings with coalition officials or during long, tense shifts on Verdania, a glance at the pendant on another's chest was enough to recenter them. The strength of their bond wasn't symbolized by 3 identical tokens. It was in the 3 distinct materials, each honoring a separate history and strength, brought together to form a stronger whole. The fused pendant Riley wore was the proof. It demonstrated that true unity isn't found in uniformity, but in the deliberate, difficult integration of different elements. The earth steel didn't change the crystal. The crystal didn't soften the steel. They coexisted, each making the other more than it was alone. Their bond was not a single note but a chord. And a chord is always stronger than any note played alone. The Coalition's report on Xerion 5 was a single page of stark text and chilling sensor readings. Every survey team sent to assess the world had returned with the same verdict: beyond salvage. The planet wasn't just damaged, it was antagonistic. Atmospheric toxins interacted unpredictably, creating corrosive compounds that ate through standard ship hulls in hours. The ground was seismically unstable, prone to sudden, violent shifts that could swallow entire landing zones. The residual energy from the weapon that had scoured the place was still active, interfering with electronics and biological processes alike. It was the most dangerous assignment the Restoration Division had ever considered. A newly established interspecies settlement was already there, though. A small, stubborn community of pioneers and refugees had touched down on Xerion's one vaguely stable continent, determined to carve out a home where no one else would bother them. They were now trapped, their ships failing, their supplies dwindling. They weren't asking for evacuation. They were asking for help to stay. The request landed on Kalen's terminal. They read it once. Then they closed the file and looked at Gareth and Riley. The question wasn't spoken. The answer was given in the silence that followed. They would go. The acceptance of the mission was a quiet thing. There were no speeches. Gareth immediately began assembling a security detail from volunteers within the fleet. This wasn't about repelling ravagers or policing a settlement. This was about surviving an environment that was actively hostile. He drilled them in extreme terrain navigation, in emergency SEAL protocols for their environmental suits, in recognizing the first signs of neurological degradation from the atmospheric toxins. Their job was to create stable perimeters in a world that resisted stability. In the medbay lab, Kalen and Riley faced a different challenge. Standard inoculations were useless. The planet's toxins mutated too quickly. Protective fields shorted out. They worked through the cycles, surrounded by the hum of analysis equipment. Kalen's approach was not to create a stronger barrier. It was to create a smarter one. They began designing a low-level, personalized energy field for each person. A resonant frequency that would subtly encourage the body's own systems to recognize and reject the foreign compounds, to see them as invaders and isolate them. Riley's contribution was a monitoring algorithm that could track the toxin's mutations in real time and adjust the field's frequency accordingly. It was healing as active camouflage. This philosophy, to heal rather than fight, to integrate rather than oppose, was about to face its ultimate test. It was born from Kalen's initial quiet confession in a dusty corridor. I don't fight well. That perceived limitation had forced a complete reimagining of what protection could be. On a battlefield, refusal to fight is a death sentence. In the complex systemic trauma of a broken world, it was the only strategy that could work. You cannot punch a toxin. You cannot shoot seismic activity. Fighting the environment would have consumed all their resources and ended in failure. Their method demanded a deeper understanding. It required listening to the damage, learning its patterns, and finding a way to redirect its energy toward reconstruction. Protection alone builds a wall. Healing builds a foundation inside the ruins. Xerion 5 would not be conquered. It would have to be persuaded. And persuasion had always been Kalen's greatest strength. The sun over Verdania was a pale gold disk sinking toward a horizon that had been nothing but gray dust months before. Now it dipped behind a line of young, deep green trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air, once thin and metallic, carried the rich scent of wet soil and new growth. Gareth, Kalen, and Riley stood on a low hill overlooking the main settlement, watching the light change. The success of the reclamation was a physical fact. You could see it. You could breathe it. The scale of it should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt heavy. The weight of what had been lost to get here was a silent presence between them. Kalen's voice was so soft it was almost part of the evening air. It wasn't a song with words. It was a melody from Droris, a morning song from their lost world. The notes were low and flowing, a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was a lament for families turned to ash, for forests that would never return, for a culture that existed now only in memory. It was the sound of grief given a shape. Riley listened for a few breaths. Then he joined in. He didn't try to mimic the alien melody. He found a harmony that was purely human, a counter-melody of resilience and hope that wove through Kalen's sorrow. The two musical lines were from different worlds. They shouldn't have fit together. But they did. They created a new, richer sound. Gareth watched them for a moment, then he added his own voice. Not a melody, a single steady bass note that anchored the others, a foundation of unwavering support. His sound was the earth. Kalen's was the memory. Riley's was the bridge. Across the compound, people stopped what they were doing. A mechanic looked up from an engine housing. A botanist paused while watering a new sapling. They turned toward the hill. The song wasn't loud, but it carried. One by one, they began to walk toward the sound. They didn't know the melody. They didn't need to. They added their own voices, their own quiet hums, their own memories of other lost homes. The song grew. It was no longer just a Droris morning song. It became something else. A shared breath, a collective acknowledgement. They sang as the last of the light faded and the first stars appeared over the new forests. The act was its own answer. The ritual that allows the transformation of grief into strength isn't a secret technique. It is the brave, simple act of creating beauty together from the raw material of individual pain. It is the decision to make music from mourning, to take the specific, lonely ache of a lost world and offer it to others, not as a burden but as a note in a shared song. That act of shared creation forges a new strength, one that is greater than the sum of its parts. It doesn't erase the loss. It builds a future around it. The song continued into the rising night, a testament to what they had saved, and a requiem for all that was gone. The invitation arrived on official coalition letterhead, the seal of the medical division gleaming under the workshop lights. It offered Kalen the directorship of xenomedical research. The attached list of resources was staggering. State-of-the-art laboratories, a dedicated staff of hundreds, a budget that could fund a small fleet. It was everything needed to systematize their healing techniques, to scale them across the galaxy. It was validation. It was also a trap. Authority was a mantle Kalen had spent a lifetime avoiding. To lead was to be visible, to be a symbol. It meant trading the quiet certainty of the workshop for the glaring scrutiny of an institution. It meant becoming the very thing that had always persecuted their kind, a figurehead in a system that valued order over understanding. They held the data slate, the weight of the offer feeling heavier than any piece of scrap metal they had ever handled. The temptation to retreat, to decline and remain in the manageable confines of Dustfall, was a palpable force. They did not decline. They crafted a counter-proposal. Acceptance was conditional. Riley Winters would be brought on as their official apprentice, his unique Winters Bridge technique recognized and given its own research track. Gareth Winters would be offered a command position overseeing fleet-wide security operations for the medical division's field teams. The trio would be a package deal. The coalition, recognizing the unprecedented value of their combined skills, agreed without hesitation. The news sent ripples through the fleet. A dragon hybrid was now one of the most influential medical researchers in the coalition. A teenage boy was a named technique developer. A retired soldier was commanding an entire security division. Their methods, once viewed as mystical outliers, were drafted into standard medic training protocols. Dragon hybrid energy manipulation techniques, adapted for human biology, began appearing in field manuals. The reclaiming ceremony, once a private act of grief, was studied as a potential psychological tool for trauma recovery. The outer edges of accepted medicine were being redrawn, and the redrawing was being led by three people who had once been dismissed as station trash: a washed-up soldier, and a curious kid. The true reason for their success as symbols of cooperation was not found in their individual achievements. It was found in the terms of their acceptance. Each had been offered a path to personal glory. Kalen could have taken the directorship and left the others behind. Riley could have been fast-tracked into the academy alone. Gareth could have resumed his military career at a high rank. They had each been handed a key to a door that led away from the others. They had each refused to turn it. Their power as a symbol came from that refusal. Cross-species cooperation wasn't an abstract ideal they promoted. It was the non-negotiable foundation of their lives. They became the face of unity because they demonstrated that the most advanced research, the most innovative techniques, and the most effective security were not products of individual genius but of unwavering loyalty. They proved that the strongest alliances are not built on strategy, but on the simple, stubborn choice to not leave anyone behind. This commitment, more than any scientific breakthrough, was what the galaxy found so compelling. It was a choice they made every day in every decision, and it was that daily choice that made them not just a team, but a standard. Kalen guided Riley's hands over the scorched fuse box, their voice a low, steady instruction. "Not a command," they murmured. "A suggestion." Riley closed his eyes, trying to find the discordant frequency Kalen described, the subtle hum of damaged energy. He focused and a sharp, searing jolt shot up his arms. He cried out, stumbling back. A thin line of blood trickled from Kalen's nose where they had absorbed the feedback. Human nerve endings were not designed for this. They lacked the natural dampeners of dragon hybrid biology. Every attempt was a risk. Every failure hurt them both. Gareth watched from the workshop entrance, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He wasn't there to intervene in the training. He was there to ensure they weren't interrupted. A sudden power surge or an external shock during these delicate sessions could be catastrophic. His presence was a silent perimeter, a guarantee of the quiet required for such dangerous work. He saw the frustration on his son's face, the quiet patience in Kalen's posture. This was a battlefield unlike any he had known. They adapted. Kalen stopped trying to teach Riley to be a dragon hybrid. They began designing techniques for a human nervous system. Riley's strength wasn't in direct energy manipulation. It was in pattern recognition and stabilization. His mother's scientific mind gave him a unique ability to identify systems in balance. His father's instincts helped him hold a line. They started working with resonant frequencies instead of directed energy. Riley learned to find the healthy, stable vibration in undamaged tissue and amplify it, encouraging the wounded cells to match that stable state. It was like tuning an instrument by playing the correct note beside it. The test came during a structural collapse in a newly built greenhouse on Verdania. A settler was pinned under a fallen beam, his leg crushed, bleeding heavily. Standard med gels slowed the flow but couldn't stop it. Kalen was across the settlement. Riley arrived, his kit in hand. He didn't have his mentor's ability to directly knit tissue. He knelt beside the injured man, placed his hands on the uninjured part of his thigh and focused. He found the steady, strong rhythm of the healthy cells and poured his concentration into amplifying that signal, into making it so loud the damaged vessels could not help but listen. The bleeding slowed. Then it stopped. The settler's ragged breathing eased. News of the technique spread. The Coalition Medical Division, already studying Kalen's methods, took notice. They gave it a name, Winter's Bridge. They requested it be added to the emergency medic training curriculum for all frontier stations. It was a technique born from limitation, a solution devised because a direct copy was impossible. The core of Kalen's ability was never about forcing cells to regenerate. That was the brute force approach of machines and chemicals. Their method was one of resonance. It worked by convincing damaged cells to remember their original, undamaged state. They introduced a precise energy signature that mirrored perfect health, a vibrational blueprint of wholeness. The cells attuned to this resonance would realign themselves to match it. It was a form of communication at the molecular level, a persuasion toward a memory of integrity. It asked instead of commanded, and in the asking, it achieved what force could not. The viewport of their ship framed Xerion 5, a world of swirling, corrosive greens and deep volcanic violets. The toxic atmosphere wasn't a haze. It was a fluid, aggressive entity, chewing at their external sensors. Static fizzed across the comms. This was the most hostile environment they had ever attempted to enter. Behind them, in the main transport hold, sat 200 settlers. Their survival, their desperate hope for a new home, was the weight on the shoulders of these three. Failure here would not be a personal tragedy, it would be a mass grave. Kalen stood before the main console, their scaled fingers resting on the cool surface. They reached up, their touch finding the earth steel pendant beneath their uniform. The metal was a solid, grounding presence. It was a promise of protection, a reminder of the man who gave it. Their other hand rose, fingertips brushing the Draris crystal resting against Gareth's chest. It was cool to the touch, a sliver of memory, of loss that had been endured. The two materials, so different, spoke of a bond that was both a shield and a memory. Riley performed his final system checks. His movements a near-perfect mirror of Kalen's own precise economical gestures. He adjusted the calibration on his environmental suit's resonance field, a custom modification they had designed together. His fingers moved over the controls with a focus that belied his age. Every flick of a switch, every tapped command was a silent testament to hours of training, of shared risk, of absorbed knowledge. He didn't look to them for approval. He knew his role. He was the bridge. Gareth finished his own final weapon check, the sound of the charge pack slotting home a sharp, definitive click in the quiet cabin. He turned from the armory locker. His gaze swept over them, Kalen at the console, Riley at the systems panel. He did not give an order. He did not offer a motivational speech. He simply placed a hand on Kalen's shoulder, then on Riley's. The contact was brief, solid, and warm even through the layers of their suits. It was not a gesture of leadership. It was an affirmation, a silent declaration that they were here, together. Then his hand fell away and he moved to the pilot's auxiliary station. The only sound was the deep, straining hum of the ship's engines as they began their descent. No one spoke. No orders were given. No fears were voiced. The trust between them had moved beyond language. It lived in the shared rhythm of their breathing, in the understood division of tasks, in the way they occupied the same space without needing to fill it with sound. Their bond was a lived fact, a structure they had built through every shared crisis and quiet moment. It required no verbal reinforcement. The ship tipped forward, nosing into the violent, colorful chaos of the atmosphere. The hull groaned in protest. Warning lights flickered across the panels. They each leaned into the strain. Their bodies braced not just against the physical force, but against the immense responsibility they carried. The survival of the settlers, the success of this desperate mission, hinged on the unshakable foundation of their connection. What allows a chosen family to endure the hardest trials isn't a single grand Shi-Yan sworn in a moment of peace. It is the accumulation of 1,000 smaller choices. It is the decision to show up for each other not when it is convenient, but when it is difficult. It is the choice to stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of fear, to trust without demanding proof, to share the weight of a terrible risk without flinching. This bond is renewed constantly, tested and proven in the daily, often silent decision to remain. It is this relentless chosen commitment that forges a unity stronger than any blood tie, making them not just a team but a single unbreakable force. Healing offered without expectation or condition can rewrite the fate of worlds. Gareth, Kalen, and Riley prove that the most formidable shield is not forged from armor, but from compassion, a veteran's protection, a healer's quiet resolve, and a boy's clear vision. Three broken individuals who chose connection over isolation. Their story shows that rebuilding begins not with weapons, but with an open hand. Sometimes saving the galaxy starts in a dusty corridor with a whisper of "I can heal," and the quiet answer, "It'll do." Redemption is a choice made together. The transport doors hissed open to reveal Dustfall Outpost, a place where broken soldiers came to forget. But Gareth Winters didn't expect to find a dragon hybrid cornered by Ravagers whispering, "I don't fight well, soldier, but I can heal." In that moment, a widowed veteran and an exiled healer forged an alliance that would change the fate of worlds. What started as protection became something far deeper, a chosen family against the void. Gareth Winters stepped off the transport vessel onto Dustfall's main concourse, the weight of 2 decades in uniform still pressed into his shoulders. His movements were economical, precise, the kind of body memory that doesn't fade even when you want it to. He hadn't come here for redemption or a fresh start. He came to disappear into the noise of a backwater station, where no one asked about the past. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and rust. Flickering overhead lights cast long shadows down the corridor, each one a silent witness to things best forgotten. He heard the disturbance before he saw it. A low, aggressive murmur cutting through the station's steady hum. 3 Ravagers had backed a lone figure against the scarred hull of a derelict cargo hauler. Their posture was predatory, relaxed in the way only armed bullies can be. The one they'd cornered stood motionless, scales glinting dully under the dim lights. A dragon hybrid pressed so firmly against the metal it seemed they were trying to pass through it. Gareth didn't hesitate. His body moved on instinct, placing him squarely between the Ravagers and their target. He kept his hands loose at his sides, empty. The lead Ravager smirked, eyes scanning Gareth's plain clothes, the lack of insignia, the tired set of his jaw. "What's a washed-up uniform doing sticking his nose in station business?" he said, the words slick with mockery. "This scrap's not worth your time, old man." But Gareth wasn't looking at the Ravager. His attention was fixed on the hybrid. There was no panic in their stance, no fight, no flight, just a deep, weary acceptance. It wasn't the look of someone afraid to die. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting to be saved. That stillness reached something in him, something past training, past duty. He'd seen that resignation before, in the eyes of civilians caught in crossfire and soldiers too exhausted to care. It was the hollowed-out place where hope used to be. The Ravagers saw a monster. Gareth saw someone who had already lost everything. The lead Ravager took a half-step forward, weapon humming softly in his grip. Gareth didn't flinch. His open palm stayed facing the ground. No threat, no weapon, just a body in the way. "Walk away," Gareth said, his voice low and even. "There's nothing here for you." The Ravager's smirk faltered. He was used to fear. He wasn't used to calm. Gareth held his ground, his silence more unnerving than any battle cry. He wasn't protecting a stranger because it was right. He was protecting them because no one else would. And in the dust and shadows of a broken station, that was reason enough. A soft sound cut through the humming station air, the dragon hybrid's voice, barely more than a whisper. It carried no defiance, only a simple statement of fact. "I don't fight well, soldier," they murmured, their gaze fixed on Gareth. "But I can heal," the Ravager snorted. One of them shifted his weight, the heavy soles of his boots scraping against the grated floor. "Heal?" he repeated, his tone thick with contempt. "What good is healing out here? You can't mend a blaster wound before it burns through you. You can't stitch up a ruptured hull with good intentions." The others laughed, low and mocking. In their world, strength meant power. Healing was a luxury for safe places, places that didn't exist on the fringe. Gareth didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on the hybrid, taking in the careful stillness, the faint glimmer of silver tracing the edges of their scales. He'd spent 20 years in a machine built for breaking things, ships, armies, sometimes men. He knew the cost of that destruction. He'd carried it home in the silence of his own house. His response was quiet, certain. "It'll do." The words hung in the air, simple and final. The Ravagers' laughter died. They were used to threats, to posturing, to the loud violence of station life. They didn't understand a man who valued mending over breaking, but they recognized resolve when they saw it. Gareth hadn't moved. His hands were still open. His posture hadn't shifted. He didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. After a tense silence, the lead Ravager gestured sharply to the others. They stepped back, then turned, their footsteps echoing down the corridor until they were swallowed by the noise of the station. The dragon hybrid remained pressed against the cold hull, their dark eyes studying Gareth. There was no relief in their expression, only a deep, guarded curiosity. This human had intervened without demand, without even asking what they were. That kind of protection was unfamiliar. Healing for Kalen was not a metaphor. It was a precise and demanding discipline, one that began where technology reached its limits. Where med scanners could only map damage, a dragon hybrid's ability worked at the molecular level, a subtle manipulation of energy fields that encouraged cells to remember wholeness. It wasn't magic. It was a form of communication, an alignment of vibrational patterns that coaxed broken tissue toward repair, that persuaded poisoned systems to purge themselves. No machine could replicate it. It required patience, focus, and a tolerance for stillness that few in a violent universe possessed. Gareth didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that in a galaxy full of people who knew how to break things, someone who knew how to put them back together was rare, and rarity had value. It had weight. He took a slow breath, the station's recycled air cool in his lungs. The hybrid watched him waiting. Neither of them moved. The hum of the station wrapped around them like a promise. Or a warning. Kalen's workshop was tucked into a service corridor deep beneath Dustfall's main concourse, a space that felt more sanctuary than storage bay. Every surface held purpose. Tools lay arranged by size and frequency of use along a magnetized strip. Containers of purified solvents stood in neat rows, labels facing outward. A single workbench dominated the center, its surface scarred but impeccably clean. This was where Gareth found himself days after the encounter, sitting on a low stool while Kalen worked on the protective layers of his transport suit. The hybrid's movements were efficient, devoid of wasted motion. Each gesture held the precision of someone who had learned the cost of chaos. They worked in silence for a time, the only sounds the soft hiss of a sonic cleaner and the distant thrum of the station's life support. Kalen's hands moved with practiced certainty, mending micro-tears in the suit's outer membrane without looking. Gareth watched, recognizing the focus of a specialist. It was a quality he respected. He didn't ask why a healer knew how to repair tactical gear. Some questions were better left in the quiet. Eventually, Kalen spoke, their voice low and even. They explained where they came from, not with pride or sorrow, but with the flat tone of a report. Drara 7 was not just a home. It was a graveyard, a world that had been erased. The Void Plague didn't kill in ways that made sense. It didn't leave bodies. It unmade them. Ecosystems collapsed not from decay but from cancellation. Forests turned to gray dust. Rivers evaporated into metallic haze. Kalen described standing on a high ridge, watching the wind carry away the ashes of their family. There one moment, particulate the next, their culture believed in mourning. They held ceremonies to honor the transition from life to memory. But the scale of the loss on Drara 7 made mourning impossible. There were no remains to consecrate, no markers to place. The grief had nowhere to go. So it turned inward. Kalen's voice didn't shake. They spoke as if describing weather patterns on a dead world. The horror was in the details, the way the plague targeted organic and synthetic systems alike, the speed of it, the silence that followed. What wiped out an entire world was not some natural disaster. It was engineered, a weaponized biological agent designed to dismantle life at multiple levels simultaneously. It broke down atmospheric balances, poisoned soil substrates, and attacked cellular integrity in every life form it encountered. It didn't just kill, it erased. What remained was void, empty space where a world had been. Kalen finished cleaning the suit. They placed it on the bench, folds aligned. The work was done. The memory was not. Riley saw the truth because he approached the problem without the burden of expertise. He wasn't a xenobiologist looking for a virus. He wasn't an engineer looking for a systems flaw. He was just a boy with a datapad and a mind trained to look for patterns in energy and matter. He didn't know what was supposed to be impossible, so he found what was actually there. The connections were hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who didn't bring a pre-written story to the data. His youth wasn't a limitation. It was his greatest asset. Kalen took the datapad from Riley's hands. The screen cast a pale blue light across their scaled features. For a long moment, they were perfectly still. Then their fingers tightened on the device's edge. The horror came not as a wave, but as a slow, cold seep. They saw the data not as numbers or charts, but as a story of methodical, planet-sized murder. The patterns in the molecular decay were not the random chaos of a natural pathogen. They were signatures, a specific replicable process of targeted deconstruction. The plague was a precision tool. It unmade biological life and environmental systems in a controlled sequence, breaking them down into base elements for easy harvesting. The respiratory failure in the crews, the ash-like residue on the hulls, the systemic collapse of ecologies, it was all by design. A harvest protocol. Kalen's mind connected the dots with a terrible, clarifying speed. The mineral signatures Riley had found. The Void Plague wasn't the primary event. It was the cleanup crew. It was the smokescreen. A corporation or a consortium of them had developed a weapon that could quietly dissolve a world's biosphere, They would target resource-rich planets, deploy the agent, and then move in once the tragic natural disaster had done its work. They wouldn't have to negotiate mining rights with local governments. They wouldn't have to pay for environmental impact studies or relocation of indigenous populations. There would be no populations left to relocate. The planet would be sterile, its resources laid bare for effortless, uncontested extraction. Their home, Drauris 7, hadn't been a victim of a galactic tragedy. It had been a mining site. Their family hadn't been lost to a plague. They had been liquidated for profit. The scale of it made the air in the workshop feel thin. Kalen's gaze swept over Riley's star chart. 23 worlds. Each dot represented billions of lives, entire cultures, complex ecosystems, all erased. Not in war, not in conflict, in a boardroom decision. This was genocide reframed as resource management, annihilation written off as an operating expense. Gareth watched the understanding settle over Kalen. He saw the minute tremor in their hands, the way their shoulders drew inward as if absorbing a physical blow. He didn't need to see the data himself. He saw the truth of it in their reaction. He had spent his career following orders, believing in chain of command in the system. This was a corruption so vast it dwarfed any battlefield atrocity he had witnessed. This was the system itself turned into a weapon. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the small room to a secured comms unit he kept in a locked crate under his bunk. It was military issue, encrypted, with a direct line to channels that bypassed standard bureaucracy. He entered his old authorization codes, his movements brisk and automatic. He was not contacting his local commander. He was reaching for the highest authority he knew he could trust. The message was brief. A request for an emergency priority channel to Admiral Reyes. The subject line was simple. Classified Omega-level threat. Planetary genocide for profit. Evidence attached. He included Riley's entire data packet. Then he sent it. The machine hummed softly, processing the encryption. In the quiet workshop, the sound was deafening. The real purpose of the void plague was not sickness. It was a business tactic. It was fear used as a tool, a manufactured horror designed to hide the systematic stripping of worlds. It was the most profitable lie ever told. The response from Admiral Reyes came not as a voice transmission, but as a tight beam data request followed by a request for a secured visual link. Gareth set up the connection in the workshop, the small holo display flickering to life on the cleared surface of Kalen's workbench. The Admiral's face materialized, sharp and guarded. The faint lines around his eyes deepened by the blue light of his own terminal. He did not offer pleasantries. "Winters," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Your transmission made some extraordinary claims. My analysts have flagged 17 previous void plague reports from the fringe. All were debunked. Localized environmental collapses. Mass hysteria. What makes your source different?" Gareth stood slightly behind the display, his posture straight. He didn't defend. He simply nodded to Kalen. The hybrid stepped forward into the projector's field of view. They held Riley's datapad, their scaled fingers resting lightly on its surface. They did not offer excuses or emotional appeals. They presented the evidence with the dispassionate clarity of a scientist delivering a post-mortem. "Admiral," Kalen began, their voice soft but utterly even. "The data from the Horizon's Dream shows a molecular decay pattern with a half-life inconsistent with any known pathogen. The energy signatures indicate a directed systemic breakdown, not a contagious spread." They pulled up a comparative chart. This pattern matches residue samples from Drauris 7, taken 3 solar cycles before its collapse. For verification, cross-reference these mineral signatures with galactic survey logs for the Crimson Nebula sector from the last decade. You will find identical particulate matter flagged as non-hazardous mining byproduct on surveyor reports for 22 other worlds that subsequently experienced unexplained ecological failure. They spoke for less than 2 minutes. Each sentence was a fact. Each fact was a piece of a larger horrifying puzzle. They showed the correlation between the plague sites and ultra-rich mineral deposits. They displayed the financial records of shell corporations that had purchased salvage rights to these dead worlds for a pittance just months after their tragedies. Kalen's delivery was clinical, unshakable. They weren't asking him to believe them. They were showing him the proof and letting him follow it to its only possible conclusion. Admiral Reyes listened without interruption. His initial skepticism, a shield built from decades of false alarms and frontier rumors, began to fracture. He watched the data stream across his own screen, his eyes tracking the connections Kalen laid out. He saw the timelines align, the financial trails, the geological impossibilities. His expression shifted. The rigid lines of doubt softened into something harder. Grim recognition. This wasn't paranoia. This was a pattern. A deliberate, calculated pattern of planetary-scale murder for corporate profit. The sheer, cold audacity of it was breathtaking. When Kalen finished, the silence on the channel was heavy. Reyes leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Transmit the full data packet to Coalition Intelligence, encryption level Sigma 9, he said, his tone now brisk, decisive. "All of it. Every correlation. Every sample. That is, exceptional forensic analysis." The praise was quiet, but it carried the weight of his office. He wasn't just complimenting their work. He was accepting its truth. The dynamic in the cramped workshop shifted instantly. The fragile trust between a disgraced soldier, an exiled hybrid, and a teenage boy was no longer just personal. It had become a strategic asset. They were no longer witnesses. They were collaborators. The Admiral called the work exceptional because it provided something the Coalition's vast intelligence apparatus had missed: a single, unified field of evidence. They had treated each planetary collapse as an isolated incident. Kalen and Riley had connected them into a single narrative, a deliberate campaign of resource acquisition disguised as tragedy. The proof wasn't in a single damning document or a whistleblower's testimony. It was in the cold, hard alignment of geological data, financial records, and molecular analysis across 24 star systems. It was a story written in mineral deposits and corporate ledgers, and they were the first ones to read it. A Coalition forensic vessel arrived at Dustfall 3 days after the transmission. It was a sleek, black craft, smaller than a frigate but packed with technology that hummed with latent power. Its crew moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of intense training and clear purpose. They unloaded equipment Kalen had only ever seen in theoretical journals: molecular resonance scanners, quantum-level decay tracers, field kits for isolating artificial energy signatures. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, requested access to the Horizon's dream. She also requested to speak with the source of the data. The Ravager who had led the harassment weeks before was brought in for questioning. He sat in a clean, bright interrogation room aboard the Coalition vessel, his bravado gone. The sterile environment and the calm, professional tone of the investigators unnerved him more than any threat of violence could. They didn't yell. They presented him with transfer records, payment receipts routed through untraceable accounts, communications logs showing his contact with a corporate liaison. He cracked quickly. He admitted he'd been paid a substantial sum to keep attention focused on the Dragon hybrid. His job was to seed doubt, to provide the station with a convenient scapegoat whenever questions about the plague arose. He was a small cog in a very large, very dark machine.